The Atlantic promotes and protects the free exchange of ideas through prohibiting the physical or virtual disruption, shouting down, blocking, or suppressing an invited speaker's right to speak. Please note disruptions of this nature will result in removal from the Atlantic Festival. Thank you for your support of this event. Please welcome Megha Garibaldi, the Chief Growth Officer at The Atlantic.
Thank you. Hello and welcome. I'm Megha Garibaldi, Chief Growth Officer at The Atlantic, and we are so thrilled for you to join us for this exciting, engaging, and great discussion exploring a pivotal question on how AI can save lives by accelerating inclusive research. This program is produced by our underwriter Genentech and is being recorded live for an upcoming podcast series by Genentech. Before we get started, I do want to take this moment to thank our underwriters for supporting the Atlantic Festival, and again, thank you all for joining us. Please do silence your cell phones, but do keep them handy. If you come across anything interesting and engaging, we do encourage you to share on your social network, and please do use the hashtag TAF24. Now let's begin the conversation.
And now for a session produced by our underwriter, Genentech, here to discuss bias to breakthroughs, transforming clinical research with AI. Please welcome Aisha Bintayeb, Director of Machine Learning for Clinical Sciences at Genentech; Brian Anderson, President and CEO at Coalition for Health AI; and Garth Graham, Global Head of Healthcare and Public Health at Google, with Joelle Brevel, Medical Mythbuster and Science Communicator.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I love it. We got an energetic crowd today. That's good. Well, my name is Joelle Brevel. I'm a fourth-year medical student, but online I've become better known as the Medical Mythbuster for addressing health inequities in the field of medicine. And I'm thrilled to be here today to kick off this important session with Genentech about transforming inclusive clinical research with AI. Over the past 60 years, the number of drugs approved in the United States per $1 billion spent on R&D has halved every 9 years. Today, it can take over $1 billion in more than a decade to bring just one new medication to market. Half of that time and cost is consumed by clinical trials, which have grown larger and more complex over the years. And even with all that investment, only 1 in 7 drugs that enter phase 1 trials are eventually approved. Artificial intelligence has already made significant inroads into early-stage drug discovery, helping identify disease targets and design new molecules. But that's just the beginning. As many of us know, AI is revolutionizing healthcare, from improving patient recruitment to optimizing study design and accelerating data analysis. And while these developments hold immense promise, the key is to balance these advances without losing sight of health equity. Without careful planning, AI could unintentionally widen the gap with these disparities. Today, I'm excited to speak with an incredible group of panelists who will explore how AI can not only streamline research, but also advance equity in clinical trials. We'll be discussing the importance of diverse data, how to involve communities in these innovations, and the critical need for transparency. I'm also pleased to announce that Genentech will be launching a podcast early next year focused on innovations in clinical research in biotech. Part of today's conversation will be featured on that first episode. Joining me on this panel are experts who will dive deep into the myths surrounding AI, the importance of diverse data, real-world applications, and policy contributions. And together, we'll tackle the big questions on the role that AI in clinical research and how we can harness its potential to advance health equity. So let's get started. I want to first start off by kind of addressing some of the misconceptions that we have about AI, the myths that exist there. Aisha, we'll start with you. But one common myth is that AI will fully replace human judgment in clinical research. How do you respond to that? And what role does this human expertise continue to play?
That's a fantastic question, I think, especially in the context we're in around AI and large language models. I truly think actually AI enhances our capabilities and doesn't really replace us. I think human judgment in general is what makes AI useful. In fact, as part of my work at Genentech, we often use AI models to train these models on very large amount of data, going from genomic sequences to clinical trial readouts that are really important in size and very complex. And I think these tools are really useful in giving us and showing us patterns that humans can't really identify without mining all of that data together. But it's truly the critical thinking of our scientists and communications with our clinicians that help us, one, form the right question to ask these data sets, and two, really have the right critical thinking about how we evaluate these models and how we leverage the outputs that they give us to really bring them to impact. So I think it's really the combination of human expertise, critical thinking, and these powerful tools that will bring and drive innovation forward.
Absolutely. I love that idea that there's that human touch that AI can never touch, or get to at least, and needing to have both of them, both that human touch, that clinical expertise, and that understanding, that critical thinking to lead to that. Ryan, what about you? What common myths do you think that exist?
Yeah, so I guess let me start by sharing. So one of the things that we're doing in the Coalition for Health AI, which is a community-driven effort to build consensus around what are the best practices in responsible AI for health as it relates to a variety of use cases. And of course, one of those use cases is the clinical trial space. There's so much promise around what AI can do. But the way I like to look at it is there's things that AI can do that can certainly be automated and, wicking away administrative work that humans might be doing. But there's a very healthy big middle where I think, as Aisha is referring to, where we're augmenting, where it still requires that human in the loop, the human expertise. A lot of examples in the clinical trial space. Let me just share a couple. One of the really exciting things when we think about engaging a more diverse group of potential patients to enroll in clinical trials is AI, just as Aisha is saying, can help identify those right patients. It can help engage and meet those patients where they're at. The use of LLMs to reach people on their cell phones in ways or media that are most accessible to them has a great promise to engage those kinds of patients that traditionally are not part of clinical trials. But it's not like AI is going to do away with how the actual researcher, the doctor, the principal investigator is actually working with those patients, engaging with them, informing them about the clinical trial. Oftentimes, the hardest part of a clinical trial is enrolling the patient, keeping them enrolled, helping them stay informed about what's going on with their own body. All of that is not going away. AIs are certainly going to augment how doctors and researchers are conducting these clinical trials, but they're not going to automate it entirely.
Absolutely. I'm thinking back to some of the clinical trials I've been a part of and the phone calls I've had to make to family members, and that's something that AI can never get to, those intangibles of understanding how clinical trials and the data you can get out of that from the subjective data that's not necessarily objective. So I love that you've talked about kind of the principal investigator to the patient to having to go in person to be at the doctor's office. Those are all things that AI can't touch necessarily, but are important parts of the clinical trial process.
Yep.
Garth, what about you?
Yeah,
what
so
myths?
I'll add this, and I'll just take the last point that Brian made and kind of go for that. So I'll speak from the perspective of a clinician being a cardiologist, but also somebody who's been a PI when I was Chief of Health Services Research in the University of Florida and running studies. And you're exactly right. And we used to run one of the studies we were funded with to do was really looking at the impact diabetes and diabetic interventions in Black populations within both the urban and rural parts of Gainesville and Alachua County. And you're exactly right. When this concept of how you conduct trials, you have to be speaking, we'd be in churches, we'd be recruiting, we'd be talking to folks about what the trial means to them, how we're going to bring back evidence back to the community, which is important for dealing with that long trajectory of issues that have being around minorities and clinical trials. And so that was part of what my group was very much heavily invested in. I'll just tell you that clinical trials is very much about the patient. It's very much around patient-centered engagement, and then how you bring those folks into the infrastructure that hopefully brings then positive impact back to them. And so AI, as I think we've all just said here, is a tool that can be served to empower investigators, empower the research infrastructure, but at the end of the day, patient-centered research, patient-centered clinical care, patient-centered, community-based anything is patient-centered. And that requires a human to be driving that.
Absolutely. What I'm hearing a lot is community building, understanding what are communities needing, making sure that you're actually investing and creating trials that are for that community. You can only do that if you understand them. I can't necessarily all the time pick out all of those different details. So some people believe that AI is only useful for large-scale or high-budget clinical trials. Aisha, I want to start with you, but can you share how AI is being applied to smaller, more niche studies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we, as a field in AI, we've made really a tremendous amount of progress in the past few years, and more massively in the past couple of years with these generative AI models and large language models in general. And I think that has changed a little bit how we think about using AI on data sets that are a little bit smaller and more complex sometimes to identify patterns out of. More specifically, I think generative AI models are really now helping us shed light on those subgroups in our data sets that we often don't really have a lot of representation of, right? And I think there's a lot of potential there in essentially augmenting what we know about those subgroups, even if we don't really have a lot of data on those. Of course, it doesn't replace the need for us going after the data sets and trying to really make sure our data sets are unbiased and ethically sourced. But I think in general, generative learning is changing a little bit the access and utility of AI in smaller kind of use cases like this. There are also a lot of use cases for AI in preclinical research, right? There's a lot we do on making disease models more physiologically relevant, such that they can actually really represent a broader set of the population and are more faithful, right, to patient data. And bridging that gap between preclinical research and clinical research is an area where there's a lot of interest and a lot of trends in applying AI to right now.
Yeah, I kind of want to jump on that and understand a little bit more about what are you seeing, how is it being used from the preclinical to the clinical, specific use cases?
Absolutely. There's a lot of interest in bringing these AI models to mine data sets that are from preclinical animal studies, and there are questions around which disease model do you choose in those preclinical studies? How do you make sure that those models are actually really representing populations of patients that are from small subgroups, but also the more average and larger groups that we often see in data sets. So that's one example. There's often also a lot of early research in trying to leverage the data sets that come out of very large clinical trials and using that to translate into early clinical programs. So there is a lot of translation happening across the development portfolio. And I think this is where AI is particularly helpful in guiding us address the right question and shedding some light on those subsets of questions that we don't necessarily see on smaller studies when we analyze them more specifically. I think one last thing I can say, there are a lot of now use cases for combining multiple data sets, and modern AI methods really help us leverage information across different modalities. So for instance, EHR, text, information coming out of images. And often when you think about these modalities in isolations, they're not powered enough in terms of data size to actually allow you to make conclusions that are robust. But when combined, they can actually shed light on patterns that we haven't seen before. And that's a very big area and trend in that space right now.
Absolutely, that pattern recognition and understanding that translational medicine and clinical trial as well. Also, as we're talking, I want you guys to think about questions, because we will have time for questions at the end. So if things are popping into mind, make sure to write that down. And you kind of talked about diverse data sets. Brian, I want to jump over to you and kind of ask about why is it essential to ensure diversity in the data sets used to train AI in healthcare?
Yeah. So one of the things I like to remind people about AI, at a very high level, when you think about it, all AI is programs that are trained on our histories. And so if you think about that, right, we collectively in our society have a certain history or histories. There are certain biases in that histories. There are certain systemic injustices in that history. And if we want to develop AI, ultimately that's going to serve all of us, it needs to be, the data that's used to train that AI needs to be representative of all of us. If we, as an example, are looking to train a model to engage a patient for a clinical trial, and I've trained that model on how to reach out to that patient and speak to them in a way that resonates with them about, whatever the benefits are of this potential drug that's on trial. I may train that model on highly educated, urban, Caucasian people, and it may work really well in engaging those people. But what about the Latino or Latina who's out in the community, who works, 2 or 3 jobs, who would potentially have to take, 2 or 3 different bus transfers to get to a clinical trial? How do I speak to that person?
Yeah.
How successful would that model be for that person? So it's really important as we think about using these tools that the tools are fit for purpose for the kinds of people that we want to engage and that we want to have these tools serve.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the really basic table stakes when we think about building AI, is that it needs to be trained on data that is representative of the people that we want to use it on.
Yeah. What are the consequences when we don't do that, when this AI isn't trained on diverse communities?
Yeah, so a number of things. I think the first and the biggest concern, certainly to me, is that you're creating what in the AI world we call unjustified bias, which is essentially discrimination. You're creating models that at a technical level may perform, to use the example I just got, may perform really well on a certain subpopulation. If I'm in a traditional AI model, it may have, they have these concepts like an AUC score. It may have an accuracy of 95%. But in a population of Latinos or African Americans, the accuracy score might be 45%. There are real world examples where you have models that have been trained robustly and in a well-intentioned way by whoever the model developer is, and it performs really well in a subpopulation. But then when you test it on any of these traditionally unreached populations, the performance is worse than a coin flip.
Yeah, absolutely. It also reminds me of a study I read recently by Dr. Ziad Obermeyer, who you mentioned before, where he talks about how AI can look at the wrong metrics, essentially. There's an algorithm that was used inside the United States that was essentially trying to look at sickness, how sick people are, and risk stratify those people when they get to the hospital. What they ended up finding was it actually wasn't looking for sickness for people. It was looking at cost of care, the AI algorithm, the cost of care, and using that as a proxy for sickness. Because Black and brown communities are often less likely to cost the system as much, when you looked at 2 people that had the same level of sickness objectively, this AI algorithm was actually suggesting that the black individuals, specifically in this case, were less sick, even though they were at the same sickness level. So another example of how when AI isn't used and trained, or we don't understand what it's actually looking at and what metrics are being used, how it can perpetuate biases down the line as well.
Yep.
Garth, I want to turn back to you and talk about communities. I know community engagement is something that you are passionate about. You've kind of talked about it in your opening as well. What role does community engagement play in addressing the mistrust of AI in healthcare, especially among historically marginalized groups?
Yeah.
And what steps can organizations take to involve community voices in the development and implementation of AI models to address those concerns?
And I'm going to, again, take a vein of what you all were just speaking about. And this concept of trust, mistrust, and whether clinical paradigms fit communities is not new. I mean, if you think of it not just in the AI context, but even how we've been treating renal disease for some time from a clinical viewpoint, as well as a number of other things in terms of lung diseases. And we've been applying concepts that may not have fit marginalized communities based on data or assumptions broadly. And so this idea, and I know if you transfer it into this concept from an AI lens, is only magnified, but it's still present in other ways. And so it's important for us to take a lens and understand, to your question, this idea of trust, mistrust. What's a history? And what are the prior remedies and concepts that we have to think about this broadly? And so again, looking back to challenges that we face with clinical trials, medicines, as well as other kinds of interventions in minority communities that were based on data that were not necessarily gathered from diverse communities. You start to see that, again, the best solution involving communities up front. Involving community engagement, this idea of messaging. One of the things I did when I was a PI was, again, this idea of how do you reach communities, be present in communities, making sure that clinical care happens not just in the doctor's office, but happens broadly and happens out in the real world. So making sure that you're out there when we are talking about care as well as research. And so I would kind of break down the solutions in three viewpoints, similar to how we use those solutions in other components of clinical care. One, engagement, other, transparency, and then this idea of bringing back the results to communities. And you find that as a very important aspect of clinical trials broadly, when you think about how you reciprocally have folks understand the importance of what was done, but understand what that means for them. And I think creating this loop of how we exchange and engage with information is a part of how we continually tackle the challenges that we face with mistrust, because bias has been a part of clinical care for a long time.
Absolutely.
Can I just add something? So
Yes.
I totally agree with you, Garth. Innovation moves at the speed of trust in so many ways. And one of the things I think that we really appreciate in CHI, so CHI has a stakeholder community of like over 4,000 organizations and a lot of patient community advocates that come from rural communities, small towns, inner cities. And there is a problem, whether or not we agree to recognize or not, around trust with AI, right? It's hard to explain how it comes up with the answers it does. And that's something inherent to some of these large language models and massive quadrillion parameter set transformers. We can't truly explain or truly understand how these things are doing what they're doing. So it's incumbent upon us as technologists, when we go into these communities and engage them, is to really ensure that we're solving problems that community wants solved. Like, I've seen so many researchers come into a community and say, like, I have this idea of what the problem is that you have. Let me tell you about it.
Yeah.
And here's this fancy AI tool that's going to solve it for you. Like, that falls flat on its face when researchers come into these communities. And so what we're trying to do with our stakeholder community and, educating the technology companies is the way that you approach these communities is you engage, you listen, you identify the problems that they have, that they are telling you, and then you build models that are going to serve them, that are going to benefit them.
Yep.
And, it's exciting for these technology companies because oftentimes the data that is readily available, as I was mentioning, is oftentimes coming from academic medical centers that are in urban environments. The data is clean, it's, pristine. And the data that is hard to get is the data that oftentimes comes from these rural communities, inner city communities. But again, coming back to, if we want AI to serve all of us, you need to make the extra effort to partner with those communities. The challenge is around how do we create those data sets and engineer those data sets in privacy-preserving way, culturally appropriate way, that actually ultimately where the model is going to benefit those communities.
Absolutely. I kind of want to take it from a community level to a macro level, looking at policies and regulations. What policies and regulations are there right now that exist to try and kind of govern the use of AI in clinical research, and are they sufficient?
Policy is totally figured out by the U.S. government. Just kidding. No. The pace of regulatory development is obviously much slower than the pace of innovation and the emerging capabilities in AI. So, like, starting from that context, it is a real challenge to create regulatory frameworks that are going to match the growing capabilities of some of these amazing frontier models and the various uses that we find these generative AI models in. There is current regulatory framework that exists from the FDA. They've been at it since the late 90s in approving software as medical device or 510K or PMA, whatever the pathway is that a device or AI is going to go through the FDA. They've approved over 800, I think, as of recently, AI tools. So there's organizations within the US government that are doing this and doing it well, but it's in the traditional AI space. It's in these, expert classifiers that are going to, identify a biomarker for research or, predict sepsis. And there's still problems as you're identifying with Ziad's paper. But it's in the generative AI space where we have so many questions, right? It's like the frontier models from Google or Microsoft or OpenAI or Anthropic. There's so many use cases.
Yep.
And we don't have clear understanding, as an example, around how to measure the performance of these models. How do you measure bias in an LLM chatbot? How do you measure this concept of reliability when you have a highly educated person that puts in a prompt and it gives one answer, and then you have someone else that might be from a different background or a different educational background that puts in a similar prompt but gets a completely different answer. And so these concepts that we have in responsible AI, we're all grappling with. And if anyone tells you that AI engineers, we got it figured out, we know how to measure bias in generative AI, we know how to measure performance in generative AI, they're lying to you. We don't have it figured out. And so really it's incumbent upon us, and I think it's an existential, urgent question that we need to answer, is how do we come together to get an agreement on what good responsible AI looks like in the generative AI space? Because that specific set of models are going to be transforming so much of how we live our everyday life in health, in communities in general.
Absolutely. Aisha, not to put you on the spot, but I see you nodding over there, so I want to turn to you.
I think that's absolutely true. Just to echo your point, I don't think there is a whole field on ethics in AI trying to figure out how we measure bias from these very large models. And I think in general, what's been very helpful right now is having users actually engage with these models has changed a little bit how we think about them and has demystified a little bit what's behind the black box, because now you can actually interact with the system and break it and understand what it can do and cannot do. And that feedback to the developers of these models is particularly helpful, because then we can actually know what to address about these systems, right? And there is an actionable item out of this that can translate into better models that are less biased, hopefully, and are performing better. So I think there is really user engagement in this is particularly helpful and very critical to the process. And then understanding a little bit better how we make our way towards and quantifying, having better metrics that can help us quantify those biases and quantify when things break is just an active area that we all need to be involved in. I can't echo that enough, yeah.
Absolutely. And we're not going to solve it here today, but I kind of want to ask everyone on the panel, how can policy and regulation help ensure that AI is used ethically and effectively in advancing health equity? If there was a policy that you were to put out there, what would that be? I'll give everyone a second if they need to think about it. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the more urgent things that we need to have in society is a level of transparency on how these models actually perform. And that performance and testing ideally should be done by independent entities, not the developers. The developers, I think, appropriately are going to have internal quality assurance testing to make sure that they're producing a quality product. But in health, in particular, in research, these models are going to be used in consequential ways. Your health as a patient, we're all patients, are going to be ultimately influenced in a lot of ways moving forward by these tools. And yet, there is no transparency around how these models perform against subpopulations. So ideally, we would have a rigorous process to ensure that these models are tested against many of the racial, ethnic groups, social determinants of health, and those features. Ideally, you would want to have transparency around how these models perform, so that, so I'm Native American, I can go to, ideally some portal and figure out how is that model working on patients like me? How's that model working on an African American population? How's that model working on someone that lives in, this zip code or that particular region? We need that kind of transparency and those kinds of policies in place if we want to build the kind of trust in these tools.
Absolutely.
Congressman Lou Stokes was a mentor to me many, many years ago. Many of you may not remember Congressman Lou Stokes, who helped build a lot of the foundation around health equity and a lot of infrastructure that you see at NIH. And one of the things that Congressman Stokes always used to say to me was that policy doesn't work without people. And he was talking about this concept of communities and community engagement. If you see a lot of infrastructure from community-based participatory research and all of those concepts, that came from the vision of leaders like him who were emanating that infrastructure concept into the federal government at the time. And so one of the things I would continue to kind of emphasize is this thread of communities, people, and how we understand the multiple aspects of that, whether that be on the consumer end, whether that be on the engagement, as I said before. But I always, whenever I hear questions like that, I always think about sitting down. A whole bunch of us at the time would always sit and learn from individuals like him And one of the things you'd always say is, policy is about people. And so even when you bring up the concept of policy, I just want to remind us that really this idea here is how do we make these, whether we're talking about the LLMs as tools or as concepts, how do we make it work for people?
Absolutely. One thing I think about a lot as well, kind of when it comes to this, is the fact that often we don't even know what algorithms are in hospitals. That there could be so many AI algorithms working, but we don't understand that they're actually being used in the first place. So I'm always wondering, why is there not a chief AI officer, someone to actually go through all of these things and understand how are biases potentially being used here? I know that's what Dr. Obermeyer's group is, but imagine how powerful that would be if hospitals or clinical research institutions or pharma companies had a position like that. So I'll just throw that one out there.
Love it.
But I'll throw, as we kind of close out this panel, I want to think about what's coming next, the real world applications and future directions. So for everyone, what future trends do you foresee in the use of AI for clinical research and health equity?
Yeah, so I'll start, and as no we're running out of time, so I'll say very quickly. I think the use case that I see is most powerful is being able to pick up the signals in populations and subpopulations, particularly underserved populations, that we can then learn and understand more from. Because we continue, not just in thinking through AI as data sets, but clinical trials broadly, suffer from the idea that we just don't have diversity, as we were talking about in terms of population. So understanding how we're able to draw conclusions and analyses and thought patterns from subpopulations, I think is one particularly pertinent outcome.
Wonderful. Brian?
Two things excite me. The first is the use of large models to the design of de novo molecules that no human has thought about, but yet can solve some of these challenging problems that we've had for a long time. Microsoft recently published a paper around multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and a molecule that they had designed with a large chemical model, and everyone was like, holy cow, we hadn't thought of this molecule before, and look, it's actually, shows some potential. So the use of AI tools to rapidly develop and shorten that period of designing or thinking about identifying a molecule and testing it in a lab, all of that's hard work that, Aisha, you could speak to, but the ability to shorten that time and to design multiple kinds of molecules, to your point, that could focus on specific subpopulations with different disease burden, really excites me. The other one is, I think 2 years from now, maybe 3 years from now, all of us with cell phones, we're going to have our own personal assistant, AI-powered tool on our cell phones. That is going to, I think, put a much finer point on how AI can meet us where we are and help us navigate, all the different things that we have in our lives. I think it will open doors for engaging in clinical trials that I didn't even know were out there, that I, might find out that are really important to me, that I might qualify for, or help me navigate a complex healthcare system and finding a doctor that I need to, treat my knee that's been hurting for the past couple weeks. Those two uses, the patient tool on my phone and the design of molecules, I think are going to transform a lot of the healthcare industry moving forward.
Amazing. Aisha?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in addition to those adding early molecules into pipelines and looking at new classes of therapeutics with AI, I think there's a lot of already existing tools right now that are being used in research biology, right? In trying to help us really understand a little bit better the fundamentals of biology and create hypotheses a little bit faster and test them faster, right? And I think that's particularly helpful because that leverages really a multitude of data sets that a human alone can't really gather and comprehend easily in an efficient way. I think the other aspect of this is in the space of adaptive trials, right? I think there's a lot of trending methods being developed in that space that would allow us in the future to potentially really make decisions as early clinical trials are running and draw conclusions faster from the readouts that we're getting from these trials. And I think that's extremely promising.
Wonderful. Well, I don't want to hog all the questions. So at this time, we're going to open it up to questioning. We're going to have someone, I think, out there in the audience. So raise your hand. They'll find you. Please speak into the microphone so that we can pick it up for the podcast as well, but also so everyone in the room can hear. I already see I see lots of hands up. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I think we're coming around to each of you. Thank you. Let me start right over here.
Hi, This question is for you, Joel. Joel?
Joel, yeah.
Joel, big fan of what you're doing on social media.
Thank you.
Was hoping to get more of your point of view. So I'm curious, as someone who is both a student and training in a hospital setting, what your day-to-day engagement is like with AI, and in particular, generative AI.
Yeah, I think for us, we don't often understand how AI is being used. And that's been a lot of my work, is demystifying where is AI being included into healthcare systems, and how do we even understand it? So for most people like myself as medical students, we don't talk about AI in medical school or how it's being used. But I wish we did a little bit more so we could understand how do we mitigate the biases within there. So I often talk about clinical equations, for example, like the GFR equation or the VBAC calculator. A lot of these then use AI in order to amplify kind of the beliefs that are within those systems, or to stratify it in different ways for patients. And so for me, that's kind of the main ways I'm seeing it, is in clinical algorithms that then get perpetuated down. Generative AI, I'm not sure how much I'm seeing it right now specifically, but I think in the next few years, we'll see it a lot more. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
And shout out to you for what you've been doing. I think she brought a very good point. A lot of people don't know, Joe spends a lot of time educating the public. Just big fan of your work as well.
Thank you.
We're all
Appreciate
fanboys,
that.
Joel.
Yeah, that's right.
See some hands over there. Yeah, we'll go over this side.
This is more public health, but how can AI be used to prevent the next pandemic?
Yeah. So I view multiple tiers to that question. One is certainly, I think Brian alluded to this, the ability to detect early signals where we may be seeing pandemics that are emerging, to be able to move faster. So you can think about it from the aspect of kind of signal detection and then reaction. And then you start to think about it from the analytical context once you get into even the idea of viral epidemiology and understanding so many concepts that for a long time it may take clinical medicine traditionally taken us a longer time to analyze viral characteristics to then be able to think through intervention. But I also even take it a step further in terms of how do we educate and reach people and take it to the kind of population end. So I see multiple tiers in terms of potential, and one of those being also this ability to reach people with information.
So this is something that I get really excited about, and bear with me if I can geek out on this for just 1 minute. So in the previous pandemic, I had the chance to work with the White House COVID Task Force and Operation Warp Speed team on the data analytics effort. And one of the most pressing questions that we had was, what should be the targets for this virus to design a therapeutic around? And even more than that, what is the overall function of this virus? And if we dock on this site or find this site to dock on, what's going to happen, right? And so one of the moonshot efforts that a lot of the technology companies partnering with public health agencies are working on are two efforts. One is if you detect a new pandemic, a new virus, a new pathogen out there, and you can identify, once you've identified the target that you want to attack, there are now AI tools that are beginning to develop the capability to develop a de novo molecule that folds and has the three-dimensional shape that's just right, that can dock to that target site in just the right way that it does the function that you want it to do. And you can model both that molecule and the folding of the molecule, the design of the molecule, and the overall function of what happens once that molecule binds to it in such a way that it has a really high degree of fidelity if you want to neutralize that virus, to be able to do that all in silico. And thinking about if we had that capability in the early days of the COVID pandemic, we would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And so those two things, the ability to model a molecule's design and its shape, and the function of the overall virus with the molecule attached in silico, and doing that quickly, I think are going to really be exciting in how many lives they'll save in future pandemics.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, the next step is trying to actually simulate what the effect of that molecule is in a cell. And there's a lot of effort right now in actually doing that computationally, such that you don't actually have to do it right away in humans, obviously. And testing that at scale is something that's really being enabled with AI within seeing the cell as a small engine that you can now probe and test in many different ways in silico is very helpful. I think it will be very helpful in these situations.
Absolutely. See a hand right over at the back there.
Thank you so much. What a great panel. Really, really appreciate it. I just wanted to bring us back to one of the early pieces that you were talking about relative to bias and validity and can we combine data sets or not. I wondered who's going to pay for all that research and are there implications, because we have CVS on the panel, Genentech is funding it. Are there implications of how we think about the financing of making AI safe enough for us?
No. I mean, I think we right now have large government infrastructures that finance research. We have government infrastructure that delivers public health both at a state and a federal level. So I think you have various tiers to think through. We simplify the concept of AI when we just say AI without understanding all the different components of everything. Even if you just think about the kind of macro delivery of, or macro response that you would need in drug delivery in response to a pandemic, that's multiple different aspects of either a government or the overall healthcare infrastructure. So what I would say in answer to that question, I think why we all kind of pause is, it's hard to tell because there's so many different tiers to that, even going down to the idea of training clinicians and researchers. So I would say that you have a lot of already pre-existing both government and private infrastructure that funds different part of the overall healthcare ecosystem, and then I can see an evolution of that into this AI, which again, depending on where it plugs into that ecosystem, has different tiers, different onus of responsibilities, and different dynamics.
So I can offer one thought that we have within the Coalition for Health AI. So in the private sector, when you think about the development of these large language models, I think candidly, the vast majority of the data that's publicly available has already been consumed to train these models. What is missing is the data that oftentimes comes from those unreached populations, those populations that if you had data, you could address some of the underlying biases in these models that we have today. So one of the hopes, again, this is a hypothesis that we're testing within CHI, is if you can bring a large technology company and alongside a community that might have a lot of potential data, but data that wasn't used by that technology company to develop that model. And you can bring them together, align incentives in so much as what I was sharing earlier, and what I think we've agreed that is like a model developer that's working with the community, you ultimately want that model to serve that community. And so if you have a tech company that has conceivably a lot of dollars, they can work with that community to essentially activate that data in such a way that it both benefits the community. The tech company has a model that's now more robust, which they're incentivized to have. The hope being that we're now creating more data sets that are more representative. We'll see. We're piloting that out with a few communities right now within CHI. So happy to share more about that as it goes. But that's one of the ways we're trying to address it.
Yeah. And Aisha, last word?
Yeah, there are many different ways, but maybe one thing I can mention is real-world data is particularly helpful in this context as well. So we often look at post-clinical trials, large-scale clinical trials in the wild. How are these drugs actually working? And we monitor and look at patient data over time. And that real-world data is very informative for the next generation of trials that we put in place, right? So for instance, if we're exploring a new molecule and really looking at a specific target, understanding a little bit if there are subpopulations where that target is actually potentially excluding is very helpful in early research. So using that data and leveraging it in early stages of development of molecules and targets is informative because it can help us really make decisions that are more data-driven, where we hyper-focus on these subgroups.
Can we give a huge round of applause for our audience, for our panelists and our audience? I want to say thank you so much to Genentech for sponsoring this panel. I think this was such a great conversation. Hopefully you got some new insights. Thank you to the Atlantic for having us as well. And thank you for all of you for the great questions. I apologize for those we can't get to, but hopefully if you find us somewhere, you can ask those questions later on. Enjoy the rest of your festival. Thank you.